Hello, this is Garrett Eckert with Simple Ministries. Please visit the website at simpleministries.org. And I'll be reading for you an article I have written entitled Why the Definition of Marriage Arguments Don't Work. And one of these arguments would be marriage is between a man and a woman to bear and rear children, or a more thorough definition given by three philosophers would be marriage is the union of a man and a woman to make a permanent and exclusive commitment to each other of the type that is natural, inherently, fulfilled by rearing and bearing children together. And that was from an article that was published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy by three philosophers named Gerges, George, and Anderson. Now, I don't necessarily want to address this topic. Many Christian leaders I know and love promote a definition of marriage type of argument. They've worked hard and been courageous where most have not been, although they should have been. Many of these same leaders are comparing the redefinition of marriage to the legalization of abortion. They say some reasons why the pro-life movement has been successful, in some part, is because they've developed better arguments over time. So let's evaluate the definition of marriage argument number one that I gave, see how it morphs into definition of marriage number two, and why neither work. The definition of marriage arguments are appealing to Christians because they offer a legal, secular argument. Biblical arguments are ruled out because of the separation of church of state, and moral arguments are ruled out because of a precedent set in a sodomy case called Lawrence versus Texas. And so these, if you need a legal, secular argument to be able to use in court. These arguments offer an absolute standard by which to define marriage, and this is preferable over a subjective standard. I mean, even if you could use a moral argument and you go to court, the judge might just say, well, in my opinion, same-sex marriage is okay, and that's how I'm going to rule. And you don't want that. You want an absolute standard that says, hey, this is the only way you can rule. These arguments are less offensive. These arguments don't directly address same-sex couples. They aren't saying anything directly negative about gays. They're talking about marriage. And restricting marriage to only moral sexual relationships, that's another good thing about it, which is between one man and one woman. Now, my main problem with these arguments, no matter how appealing they may be, is that they simply are not valid. One could show this either by counter-arguments or analogies. Now, analogies compare different things, but in some way related things. The comparison is made to something a person offering the argument understands to be true. Since they understand the truthfulness of one thing, it is easier to explain the truth of another. Many advocates for same-sex marriage reject all analogies against their view while using them to promote their own view. Now, this is cherry picking, and it prohibits such advocates from actually truly understanding their own position. They claim those who disagree with them are ignorant, and some are, but they're calling the kettle black. They're guilty of the same thing that they charge others. Now, typically, in the easiest response that folks will give to a definition of marriage argument will be to give an analogy, such as, what about elderly people? Should they be allowed to marry? Now, elderly heterosexual marriages are different from young heterosexual marriages. The young can procreate unless there's a biological problem, but the elderly cannot by biological design called menopause. All advocates of this argument understand that elderly should be able to marry. The analogy is valid and it shows procreation is not necessary for marriage. But no problem, says the definition of marriage advocate. The elderly couple still exhibits the structure or type of procreative marriage that young couples do. Now, that is not just an elaboration of the first argument I gave, which, to review, is that marriage is between a man and a woman to bear and rear children. Oh, it's more than that. It actually is a new argument that is actually given in the second argument I gave, because the three philosophers use the phrase of the type. They're not saying that you absolutely have to procreate. It's good enough if you just have the type of relationship that normally does procreate. Now the definition of marriage argument number 1 has actually morphed into a new argument that I will name marriage argument number 2, given by the three philosophers. Now this structure or type is an abstract and difficult argument to understand, but Gerges, George, and Anderson give us the only analogy I've ever heard to help make their point clear, and that's an analogy related to baseball. They say that when a baseball team doesn't win, it doesn't mean that they're still not a team. So by comparison, although an elderly couple does not procreate or win, they still are a valid married couple, like the baseball team. Now, when evaluating an analogy, the goal is not to point out some differences and declare disanalogy. Of course there are differences. Analogies compare different things. The goal is to be fair and to understand how the analogy relates to the argument. So let's relate their analogy to professional baseball. I'm going to do this because marriage is the big leagues of romantic relationships. It's not appropriate to equate marriage to Little League team where the kids are mostly out just to play for fun. So let's say someone wanted to form a baseball team made up of 70-year-old men to play in Major League Baseball. Now, this has never happened because there's no point. It would not be a valid Major League Baseball team. No owner is going to invest millions in it. Nobody wants to manage a group of 70-year-old men. No spectators want to see a team which is guaranteed to lose every game as they play against players half their age. Even the players wouldn't be interested. But elderly couples are interested in marriage despite that they can't win, that is, have kids. In fact, most are happy that they can't win. In fact, most would be horrified if they did. So, is there an alternative argument that we can give to the marriage arguments that have been so popular? Well, here would be one. That only morally good relationships should be promoted. Now, what I like about this argument is that it is a secular argument. Secular people have morals too. There are sexual relationships that they find immoral. And if they're going to condemn Christians for having moral standards, then they're going to condemn themselves as well. And it establishes that common ground that all people have morals, and it's commonly understood that we're going to have these differences. And just because you have moral differences or standards doesn't automatically make the other people bad, that they're haters or bigots. It does actually offer an absolute standard because absolute moral laws do exist. For example, it's wrong to murder others for fun. And this helps lead and give us an opportunity to talk about the ultimate lawgiver, and that is God. This argument addresses the root of the issue, which is morality. Marriage is really a symptom. I mean, for example, what if the Department of Education were to offer free condoms to proms throughout the country? Would Christians say, well, it doesn't involve marriage, we're okay with that? No, it's immoral to promote premarital sex, and Christians would oppose such efforts. And what I also like about this argument, and I'll repeat it again, that only morally good relationships should be promoted, is that it's broad enough to address non-marital relationships. I mean, just for example, what if I had a daughter who grew up and she was bisexual. She said, I'm attracted to both genders, and we talked about it because she's asking me what should I do, and I'm pointing out about the pros and cons, and she agrees, okay, the best thing for me is to pursue someone of the opposite sex for marriage. But she has a girl at school who's asking her out, wants to take her to this new movie that she really wants to see, and she says, hey, I have no plans on marrying this girl or anything like that. It's just one day just to go out and have fun. What do you think? Well, I don't think same-sex relationships are moral, so therefore, regardless of whether it leads to marriage or not, the answer is no. Now, what I don't like about this argument is that it won't work in court. As mentioned before, because of precedent in earlier court cases, a moral argument like this will not either be allowed or it just won't work. The justices will not be accepting of it. But I'm not a lawyer. My concern is not a court of law, but is actually the court of public opinion. I'm concerned with the large and ever-increasing number of people who mistakenly think to oppose gay rights is hateful and bigoted. This needs to be dispelled if we are going to be able to share the love of God with others. Also, what I don't like is that it's rather offensive, or at least more so than a definition of marriage argument. Contrary to what people think, most conservative Christians don't like offending gay people. Focusing on marriage and avoiding addressing the morality of homosexuality is appealing and less offensive, but it does not address the root of the issue, which is one reason why we continue to lose ground on these issues. Because as we're not addressing the root of it, and the other side is able to paint the picture as they want. And while absolute moral laws do exist, getting secular people to understand this, and that is rooted in God, is a very rare occurrence. So, in conclusion, honest arguments have a purpose, and that is to persuade people of the truth. This is the goal of Christians concerning marriage and morality. Definition of marriage arguments were developed to provide a secular legal defense in court. Now, these arguments did not work in part because they are not valid. Just as pro-life arguments were developed and improved over time, marriage and morality arguments need to do the same. Despite advances in the pro-life movement, even if Roe v. Wade were challenged at the Supreme Court today, the pro-life side would still lose. We cannot do much about the courts, but we can do much about the court of public opinion. We need to change, adapt, and speak the truth in love. Thanks for listening.